Hello and welcome to the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where we take a closer look at news research, headlines, and trends so that you can make more informed choices about what you're putting on the dinner table or in your kids' lunchboxes. And one of the headlines that may have caught your attention recently pertains to some new legislation in the state of California, which bans the use of certain food colorings in public schools. So I wanted to take this opportunity to clear up some confusion on this topic. And perhaps it's best to start by setting the record straight on a few things. Number one, California has not banned the use of these ingredients across the board. Rather, they've decided that foods containing these particular colors may no longer be served as part of its public school breakfast and lunch programs. Number two, contrary to some other things you may have read online, these ingredients are not already banned in other countries. These colors have, in fact, been approved as safe for use in human foods by both the European Food Safety Authority as well as by Health Canada. What is true is that the EFSA allows the use of these colors in some types of foods, such as candy or beverages, but not others, such as ready-to-eat breakfast cereals. And number three, this new ruling might cause you to think that there might be some new research showing that these colorings are harmful. But in reality, the evidence on food colorings and hyperactivity or other behavioral issues in kids remains mixed and inconclusive. Before we talk about the rationale behind this new restriction, let's talk about what these food dyes are and why they are even added to foods in the first place. So if you start reading ingredient lists, you might be surprised at how many foods have added colorings, foods that you'd never expect, like yogurt, cheese, chicken nuggets, and even crackers. And sometimes these dyes are added just to enhance a color that already exists. For example, they might put a little bit of blue dye to make white frosting look even brighter. The synthetic dyes that are approved by the FDA for use in foods are identified by number, as in yellow number 5 or blue number 1. And sometimes you'll see the word lake after it. And the word lake indicates that the dye has been mixed with a mineral salt to make it insoluble in water. So the straight dyes are generally used in drinks and other liquid foods, and these lake colors are more likely to be used in baking and other solid foods. And by the way, the fact that you might not see these ingredient names on packages in other countries does not necessarily mean that they aren't being used in other countries. Sometimes the same ingredient simply has a different name. So we may think that we don't want anything unnatural in our food, but consumers of consumer preference show over and over again that foods that are enhanced with synthetic colors are more appealing than those that are made with natural colorants or with no color at all. And the color actually affects how we perceive the taste of the food. So believe it or not, the macaroni and cheese made with yellow dye tastes creamier and cheesier than the all-natural brand with no color added. And ironically, synthetic colors tend to be more stable and perhaps surprisingly, better at making food look the way we expect it to look. All of the colorings approved by the FDA have been thoroughly evaluated for safety. But nonetheless, artificial food colors definitely have gotten a bad reputation. And in particular, there are these persistent concerns that they may cause, or perhaps exacerbate, hyperactivity or ADHD in kids. The idea that food colorings might be linked to hyperactivity in kids dates back to the 1970s, when a pediatrician named Ben Feingold proposed a diet that eliminated all artificial colorings and preservatives as a treatment for hyperactivity. And he claimed that this protocol was highly effective in reducing symptoms. Now, other experts have questioned his results, claiming, among other things, that when kids didn't do well on this diet, he simply excluded those cases from his data. Nonetheless, Dr. Feingold's hypothesis has spurred others to research this question. And you know what? It turns out that this is a particularly tricky subject to study. Measuring, quantifying the level of hyperactivity in a kid is essentially a subjective judgment. And it turns out that the results depend a lot on who is doing the rating. So, for example, it seems that parents are more likely to rate their children's behavior as hyperactive than teachers or clinicians are. And not surprisingly, their expectations also color those judgments. So when parents think that their kids have been given food additives, they tend to perceive an increase in hyperactive behavior, whether or not the kids actually did ingest them. Years ago, I heard an interview with a mom who claimed that she could tell which artificial colors her child had eaten based on his behavior. Red dye made him aggressive and hostile, she said, and blue dye made him sort of weepy and sad. And notice that the associations that she observed line up exactly with common idioms. So when people are angry, we say that they're seeing red. And when we're depressed, we say we are feeling blue. I think that's a pretty striking coincidence. Even if you only look at double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, the so-called gold standard of research design, the results are still very inconsistent. Some studies have found that food colorings did seem to increase hyperactive behavior. Many found no relationship, and a few even found that food coloring seemed to decrease hyperactive behavior. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is a very large and diverse category of ingredients. So we want to be really careful about overgeneralizing what research there is. Unfortunately, most of the studies looking at this use a cocktail containing several different food dyes. So even when a link has been detected, there's then no way to know which of the several chemicals in that cocktail might be responsible. Now, it is certainly possible that some kids are more sensitive to some of these additives, the way some kids are allergic to peanuts. And in fact, some school districts have decided to eliminate peanuts and other types of nuts from school food service, and even asked parents not to use it in homemade lunches. And the idea here is to decrease the chances that a kid with a nut allergy would be exposed to a substance that might have dangerous consequences. I mean, imagine trying to police an elementary school cafeteria just to make sure that nobody's trading their peanut butter sandwich for something they like better. And there seems to be a similar ethic behind these food color restrictions. California's stance is that while not all children may be affected by synthetic dyes, it may be wise to limit exposure, especially in school settings where children with sensitivities could be impacted. Although in this particular case, the mandate does not extend to what parents put in their kids' lunchboxes, only what's served in the cafeteria. And this is an example of what's known as the precautionary principle, which says that if a question is not completely settled and erring on the side of caution is unlikely to cause any harm, then why not just be on the safe side? Not everyone agrees with this logic. Some industry groups argue that California's actions are an overreaction and could cause confusion or unwarranted concern about ingredients that have been determined by the FDA to be safe. And many health experts and food scientists argue that while some children might experience subtle behavior changes, the overall impact on the population is just not large enough to justify this level of regulation. So in terms of practical impact, this restriction is likely to impact packaged snacks like crackers, chips, and cookies, beverages, especially brightly colored fruit drinks or flavored milks, breakfast items, including certain cereals and some pastries or muffins, and condiments and sauces that might be used in cafeteria settings like ketchup, salad dressings, or dipping sauces. However, because of the relatively limited scope of this current legislation, I think it's probably not going to result in widespread product reformulations. More likely, the affected school systems will simply substitute similar products that meet the criteria or just eliminate them altogether. So, how this is going to end up impacting things like food waste or actual classroom behavior remains to be seen. But if all of this has you wondering about the role that food dyes may play in your family's diet, here are 4 takeaways for you. Number 1, food dyes are not a problem for most kids. Some kids appear to be especially sensitive to additives, and for those kids, avoiding artificial colorings may be helpful, but for the majority, these dyes don't seem to cause any issues. And if you are trying to avoid synthetic dyes, keep in mind that they're often used in children's medications like cough syrups as well. Takeaway number 2 is that eliminating food dyes probably won't completely solve this problem. ADHD usually has several contributing factors. If your child is sensitive to food dyes, avoiding them may help, but it will probably only be one part of the solution. Number 3, a healthy diet is going to be naturally low in food dyes. Candies and sweetened drinks are the most concentrated sources of food dyes. And even if you avoided all food dyes, you still wouldn't want your kids eating that stuff in large quantities. The easiest way to minimize your child's exposure to these food colorings is just to limit their consumption of those foods. And that's also going to improve the nutritional quality of your kid's diet. And I think that's also likely to have a positive impact on learning, mood, and behavior. And then finally, don't sweat the small stuff. Eliminating every trace of artificial coloring from your child's diet would be a very tough job. Fortunately, this is not like a peanut allergy where the smallest trace can trigger a reaction. Some of these studies that link behavior changes to dyes are based on some pretty high doses. For example, the amount of food dye that was linked to behavior change in one study was the equivalent of an 8-year-old child eating half a pound of candy in a single setting. The same behavior changes were not observed at lower amounts that would probably be much more typical. So, having reviewed all the arguments for and against, what do you think? Did California go too far, or maybe not far enough? Feel free to send your questions or your comments or suggestions for future episode topics. You can email me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. You can also leave me a voicemail at 443-960-6206. I'd also like to invite you to check out my other podcast. It's called The Change Academy, and we talk about creating positive behavior change in our own lives as well as in our workplaces and communities. You can find it on all the major podcast platforms. Just search for Change Academy. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Our team includes Brandon Getches, Nathan Sems, Davina Tomlin, Holly Hutchings, and Morgan Christensen, as well as Nate Hoops. That's all for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next week.